The Edison 365 podcast explores the best practices and deep insights of modern-day Edisons, people who innovate 365 days of the year. This podcast is brought to you by Edison 365, the company that enables idea management from idea to business impact.
In today's episode, we will talk about bridging traditional leadership with actionable innovation, learn about what we call the innovation theater, and dive into how your business can sustain relevancy towards your customers and the extraordinary people you want to employ in the future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Edison 365 podcast. My name is Stuart Noyce, and I'm joined by my partner, Dennis Hull. Our guest today is Cris Beswick, author of the award-winning book, Building a Culture of Innovation, who, as a consultant, helps his clients shape the future. Cris, thank you very much for taking this interview with us today. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll go through some profile questions.
Cool. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. As everyone's just heard, my name's Cris Beswick. I'm based out of London, and although work globally with lots of really cool, interesting, but challenging corporate clients, predominantly around innovation, strategy, leadership, and culture, hence the latest book, Building a Culture of Innovation.
Excellent. Thank you, Cris. What is the unmet need that you address with the culture of innovation?
What with that specific book? The main thing for me, the main reason for the book was my publisher said, called us in quite a few years ago now and said, look, we've done some research, we've done some questions, been asking CEOs questions around what kind of books they want. And the overriding answer that they got back was, we still need to understand innovation, but don't give us another innovation book that reinforces why we need to innovate and why we have to become innovative. As CEOs, as senior leaders, we get that. What we're struggling with is, how do we actually do it? So the need about the book was to be less theoretical and less, complicated than many of the books on innovation out there are, but to write something that was really pragmatic, really simply less theory, and more reality and practical steps for helping leaders understand how to start to build innovation capability and culture.
That's beautiful. What special skills and experience do you bring to your work?
That's a great question. I suppose if you look at the world that we now operate in around innovation, the world requires, and CEOs and organizations require creativity. They require entrepreneurship or even intrapreneurship inside the organization. All of that needs a different kind of leadership. And the bedrock to all of the things that organizations are doing around innovation are things like empathy and jobs to be done and design thinking predominantly. And my special skill, I suppose, is I spent 15 years in the design industry as a product and industrial designer. And through that 15 years, I was an entrepreneur. I started my own design consultancy in the early 2000s, then became a CEO, and finally, really fortunately, had a full exit just before Lehman Brothers crashed. So all of those things, which were part of the first part of my career, all of those ingredients, I bring all of those into the corporate setting now. And I've been really fortunate that all of those ingredients are exactly the things that senior leaders and CEOs and organizations are trying to understand. So that's what I hopefully bring as part of the work that I do.
Okay, what is the solution then that you're bringing to the unmet need? So given your skills and experience, how have you packaged this into a solution?
The main thing for me is bridging the gap between traditional leadership, i.e., and not to take anything away from all the programs and all the business schools and all the development work that many of the senior leaders and CEOs that I work with have already done. But it's bridging the gap between that real great base foundation of good leadership and then the bridging the gap between what it then actually takes to lead for innovation. And the gap that I fill, or the gap that I help bridge, the unmet need, is most of my clients, big corporate organizations globally, the senior leaders and CEOs are very good leaders, but they still haven't been taught properly how to lead for innovation. And that's the main gap, the main unmet need that most of the work I do meets.
Okay, so with the solutions that you have, I'm assuming you have clients and you're offering services. Do you have any products? Maybe take us through how you get paid for the time that you offer.
Yeah, so traditionally, I suppose the word or the phrase is consultancy. Most of my work is more advisory than consultancy. So I do get my hands dirty from time to time, but the majority of it is advising, working with senior leaders and senior teams, helping them understand how they need to solve problems and how they need to do it, as opposed to the traditional consultancy approach, which is going in and solving things for people. So it's much more advisory based. I do a huge amount of speaking. So globally, a good proportion of my my income, if you like, the questions about how I get paid for my time, a good proportion of that is derived from keynote speaking. But then also, many of your viewers probably know my business partner, Dan Tomer. Dan and I have something called AIM, which is the assessment for innovation maturity. So it's an enterprise-wide innovation maturity tool that helps us assess the maturity levels of big corporate clients. And we run that maturity assessment with clients all over the world before we actually start an engagement. But that forms quite a significant part of our proposition.
Okay, excellent. What upcoming initiatives are you particularly excited about this year?
For 2020, there are some really exciting things. How do I describe them without disclosing things I'm not allowed to disclose? Yeah, it's a difficult one, right?
Well, just tell that here's another way of thinking about it. Just tell me what your objective is for the year.
So I can disclose a few things. So we have a really exciting piece of work with ING, one of the big global banks. I won't go into what that work is, but as a client, they are super switched on around innovation. They're passionate about innovation. It's a core part of how they do things today, and a core part of how they're going to shape the future. And the work that Dan and I are going to be doing with them throughout next year is really exciting. And then I have on the horizon throughout 2020 something I'm really passionate about, which is using all of the things that we've talked about so far and all of the things we're probably going to talk about in terms of my skill set and the things I do, using them to do a really important piece of work with part of the government here in the UK. To try and really shape how some of our essential services are delivered across the UK. So that's a really exciting piece of work that's on my agenda for 2020.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for going through those questions with me, Cris. I'm going to turn the mic over to Dennis Hull, and he's going to ask you a few very specific questions, and I'll follow up later with my own, particularly after listening to what you guys have to say.
Cool. Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Stuart. So, Cris, this March, I graduated from Holt International Business School with a degree in disruptive innovation.
Uh-huh.
That means that I have all of these tools like design thinking and business model canvas and jobs to be done, like you mentioned earlier. But can you give us more details about your journey from being a designer to who you are today? You mentioned something about the Lehman Brothers.
Yeah, so Lehman Brothers was, it's just, I look back and think, what an incredibly lucky few days. So, the context of Lehman Brothers is, I built a group of design companies in the early 2000s, and wanted to go and do something else around 2007. towards the end of 2007, and started an exit to sell basically my shares in the business. The deal took about 7, 8, nearly 9 months to complete, and purely by chance, I signed with the lawyers on September the 9th, 2008. So that was my exit official on September the 9th, and Lehman Brothers crashed on September the 15th. So 5, 6 days later, I'm fairly confident that deal wouldn't have gone through, because, the world collapsed, as we all know, as part of Lehman Brothers going down. So I think, the proverb around, cats have 9 lives, I think I used all 9 of mine up in September 2008.
And since then, you mentioned earlier, referring to the quick note about the book that you wrote. You said that business leaders understand that there's a need to innovate. But why would you say that organizational culture is such an important facet of that innovation?
Yeah, so the book came about in around 2015, 2014, 2015. And as I said, my publisher had, they're one of the biggest global business book publishers in the world, and they annually do a lot of surveys and reach out to all of the corporate world to say, look, what things are you struggling with at the moment? What do you need more thought leadership on? And how to drive innovation and build innovation culture was one of the themes from their research. So I think the tone from the business community at that time was, we know we need to innovate. We get, the whole language around, disrupt or die, and all of the things that were part of common vernacular around innovation. They got all that. They just didn't have enough information on how to actually do it. So, my work really has always been built on the principle of the things you just mentioned: design thinking, outcome-driven innovation, empathy, really understanding people. And when you come from a creative background and a design background, the way that you collaborate and work together as teams, when you're a CEO, when you lead an organization like that, you fundamentally understand how important collaboration, teams, groups of people are, and ultimately culture. And that's why we focus the book purely on culture. And if even at the time, a lot of the research we did was starting to show that organizations weren't focusing on culture. They were focusing on the front end of trying to innovate and trying to create new products, because they were reacting to the recession we were in. They were reacting to what had happened in 2008 with Lehman Brothers. But as we've seen over the years, of the past few years, most of those organizations have realized that their investment in innovation hasn't paid off. So, despite accelerators and labs and teams and, huge amounts of money being spent teaching people about lean or, how to be entrepreneurs, all of that hasn't paid off. And we now know that organizations where it hasn't paid off, it's because they haven't changed what happens on a day-to-day basis. Right? If you look at the latest McKinsey survey, it shows something like, don't quote me on the number because it was a few days ago since I read it, but it shows something like 90-something% of senior execs say they're still not satisfied with how their organizations are innovating or their innovation performance. And the reason for that is that it's this focus on all the other things apart from the fabric of the organization. So they haven't changed culture, they haven't changed behaviors and routines and what happens on a day-to-day basis. And that really is why culture is so important.
Do you find that most low-performing management teams or organizations do a lot of changes that are visible and maybe not that many changes that are invisible? Am I understanding you correct there?
So what I mean by that is, let me probably put it in a way that's more easily understood. There's been a huge amount. We all know there's been a huge amount of innovation theatre. So lots of upfront innovation work that's very visible to people, that looks as though the organization is very mature in terms of its approach to innovation, but actually there's been very, very little impact from all that. What we're now seeing is those organizations realizing that spinning up innovation labs and accelerators and hubs and all of that kind of activity looks great when you're looking in and at those organizations, but hasn't really changed the way the organization operates, the way it looks for problems, the way it tackles problems, and the way it solves those and builds solutions, i.e. the way it ultimately innovates. So there's been a lot of noise and work and theatre around innovation, but very few companies can tangibly say that their investment in innovation has paid off. What we're now seeing is that those organizations have got everything in place apart from the culture and the leadership component, which is predominantly what we work on with them on.
That's a beautiful clarification there. And something that I find great about this conversation, this interview, is that both you and Stuart, you're both experienced in the innovation space, while I, a recent graduate, I'm obviously newer. And innovation can be hard; it can be frustrating. So, what are some actionable steps or advice that you would give to people who are, one, just starting their innovation journey, and two, to those who have been in the innovation space for a while and feel like they might have exhausted their innovation potential by now?
Well, I think the first off, let me answer the second bit first, because, that fatigue that you mentioned, I've been in my organization several years. I've been trying to champion and drive innovation, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I'm now, am I exhausted in terms of the amount of effort that I'm putting in? If as a leader we start to hear that, we've got to be incredibly worried, because those people that put that amount of effort into trying to shape the future of an organization, they're incredibly rare. And if people like that start to feel exhausted, then organizations all over the world should be really, really scared, because we can all employ people to do jobs and perform roles and comply with their with their employment contract and their specific obligations around their role, and et cetera, but innovation takes more than that, right? It takes what I call the willing contribution. You can't contractually force people to be passionate and creative and want to challenge the organization and want to do more. So for leaders out there that are aware of people like that, my advice is get a grip on that situation really quickly, because those are the people that are going to help push the organization forward. For people out there listening that are thinking that, those things, they've been doing this for a while and, the organization isn't really passionate about it. There's two things. Find an organization that is really passionate about it and demonstrate to that organization that you are passionate about innovation and want to solve things, want to challenge the organization. Because the way that, if you think about the way that we're shifting now in terms of the skills and the contribution that organizations need from people, we're going to need those passionate entrepreneurs more than ever. And then to answer your first question, for people that are starting out in this space that are passionate about innovation, I think the best thing to do is understand that innovation isn't a thing that you do, and it's not a thing that you are or a thing that you have as an organization, but innovation is an outcome. Innovation is the end result of lots and lots of hard work, lots of skills, frameworks, methodologies, approaches, behavior, all of those things. And the end result of all of that work, really understanding customers, identifying a genuine, deep systemic need or an opportunity, and taking that all the way through to its hopefully successful conclusion. At that point, that's when you've innovated. That's when you've done something that's innovative. That outcome is only really when we should be labeling things innovative or saying that we've done something innovative. And understanding that approach and understanding all of the things that innovation requires, I think is still quite a rare commodity in the corporate world. There are people that understand bits of that process. But if you can demonstrate as an employee, that you understand exactly what it takes to do innovative things, that's an incredibly valuable person to an organization. So if you are starting out in this space, just, soak up every bit of insight around what it takes to go from how you find problems and how you understand what customers need, right through to being able to measure the impact of the solution. And if you can understand everything through that process, that's an incredibly valuable person to any organization on the planet.
Man, I'm feeling so inspired just listening to that, because I remember back to school, where people were saying that I'm not innovative, and what you're saying here is really, soak up soak up information, talk with people, and kind of learn your path and bring your special sauce into the blend of ideas and conversations, and eventually, if you're passionate about building something extraordinary with other people, you will find that you definitely are innovative.
Yeah. And I think what you've just said there is really interesting, right? The word you used was, if you're passionate about, doing things and solving problems with other people, right? That one phrase is really important. We don't live in a world now where there are lone innovators, right? Where there are mavericks who, crazy inventors that just go off and do things in isolation. The world of work is about creative collaboration. And if you can be, and if you are passionate about working with or helping others solve problems, then that's a fantastic mindset to have. And if you can just work on that bit, that creative collaboration makes you, think about how many people are going to want you on your on a team or an innovation program. If you can bring that kind of perspective and that passion and those kind of skills.
Exactly. And one side, me searching for jobs, or I have a job now, but for other young innovators that are actively searching for a place to work, they are more and more trying to see or determine whether or not an organization has the appropriate culture for them, so that they can feel like, oh, here I can grow, here I can be challenged every day in a positive way, etc. And the other side of that coin is the employer. They need to create this organizational culture that attracts these kind of people, these extraordinary human beings.
Absolutely.
But what are the greatest challenges for the employer in developing the appropriate organizational culture, and what can they do to overcome those challenges?
That's a great question. The way you introduce that question is really important. You asked earlier about, why is culture so important, and what you've just said there highlights one of the reasons why, it's super important now more than ever. Take this as an example. So this is something that I share with senior leaders and boards. If we get onto the conversation about this, imagine a world where you no longer interview the young people that are joining your organization. Traditionally, we as senior managers and leaders, we have had the power to grant a young person a job, or not just a young person, anyone, right? But if we're talking about new talent, we traditionally have had the power to grant that young person a job, to grant them a start on the ladder to kick off their career. And typically we do it from that perspective. I have a job. You as a candidate, you need to prove to me that you are better than all the other people that I'm going to interview. And if you do a good enough job of that, I'm going to give you the job. The challenge is now, and what I say to every senior leadership team that I work with, is the tables have now turned. Most corporates are, not necessarily losing the war on talent, but they're definitely not winning the war on talent. And the reality of the world that we're in and rapidly moving even deeper into is those talented young people who understand the world so much better than we do, we have to now take on board that they are interviewing us. Those young people will choose whether they want to come and work for us. It's not the other way around anymore. And that means the job of leaders and the culture that they build, and the culture that is able to be communicated internally, but more so externally, that says, we're so progressive, we are going to shape the future, we're purpose driven, look how amazing all our people say it is to work here, we're solving really systemic, important problems, every day in this organization, and on an annual basis, here are some of the things that we've done to make the world a better place. And if you come and work for us, you have the opportunity to do that, right? There aren't many companies in the world that can communicate externally as I've just sort of, communicated. But that's the challenge that organizations who are wanting to drive innovation and build a culture of innovation, that's what it helps them do. It helps them attract really amazing, talented young people. And the ones that do that better than everyone else will be the ones that out-innovate everyone else. The challenge is, to answer the main bit of your question, is that's a huge turnaround for many big corporates that are still in existence in the world today. Because of their size and the inertia that being established for decades or even hundreds of years has, it means it takes a long time to change the fabric of those organizations to be able to create a place where you can articulate it in the way that I did a few minutes ago. And predominantly, I think that's a leadership issue. I think it's about senior teams needing to understand better how to lead for innovation and the culture that requires.
This is some awesome food for thought, a lot of great advice, and this is an incredibly interesting topic that I think that we could have another interview later on about. Cris, thank you so much for answering those questions. I think Stuart is sitting with a few more questions for you, so I'm just gonna hand the mic back over to him. Go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And it is in fact true. I have so many questions now. I mean, I'm really excited, Cris, by this conversation, and not the least of my excitement comes from the fact that I think you're a great blessing to those who are true innovators. You are speaking a language that those people who regularly challenge the status quo, who regularly look for new ways to add value, and challenge their organization to deliver them. That's actually not something that is necessarily, I would say, rewarded in some of these large corporates. And in fact, innovation culture has always seemed to me to be a lip service in many of these companies. However, but as you said, if they actually are just making it an innovation theater, if they are just giving it lip service, they're probably going to fall behind those companies that are more innovative. So yeah, let's look at this in practice, right? Mm-hmm. When you have one of the, you go and you're advising a company, maybe you're providing consulting services to them, what do you face with them? How do you get them to get over the fact that, well, maybe we just want to make this look good, but you say no. It needs to be more than just something that looks pretty. It needs to be something that delivers an outcome.
So the first thing is, just as it happens, the advisory firm that Dan and I run, we specifically renamed it Outcome. So our whole narrative is around driving those outcomes, and we've actually been quite specific in not having innovation even in the name of the. We didn't want to have our consultancy, XYZ innovation or something like that. We wanted to move away from using the word, and part of the reason for that is to try and show senior leaders and get them to understand that innovation is an outcome and not a thing. So all the theatre and, the labs and things like that, all of the things that have soaked up millions and millions of dollars for many corporates around the world, demonstrably, and this is in a boardroom, in a kickoff meeting, give me a list of outcomes. Like, tell me, if you're doing okay, right? One, why are we sat here and why have you called us? Because, you must want us, you've asked us to come and talk to you for a reason, right? So now we're here. Don't tell us that everything's okay, right? And you don't need to change. So there's a demonstrable reason that you've asked us to come and talk to you. And my expectation is that reason is because the outcomes that that organization and those senior teams really want haven't materialized. So when you have a very frank and firm conversation with senior teams, in my experience, it's not that difficult to get them to understand that, yes, actually, I get the point about relevance, and we already know that we are less relevant than we were a few years ago. And yes, I get the point about, you've put us on the spot and you've asked for demonstrable outcomes. Well, actually, we can't really point to any. So it's just about challenging those senior teams who, in many cases, very, very rarely get challenged on questions like that.
Yeah. So let's look at that a little bit more in depth there. So what I took away from your answer is that it might not be dramatic enough a problem. That, yeah, we're not innovating, but we're not really in trouble here.
Exactly.
Right? And so there's no real reason to just jump up and down and try to break everything in your culture so that you can become more open to things that are new.
Yeah.
And that's really all this is. It's just being open to changes and to adjust, and being willing to make some bets every now and then. So, but it can be too late. So what is there a way to explain to them, maybe show them examples that say, here's a company that was doing just fine, but then it didn't make the next move, and their competitor did, and then they were out.
Yeah, I mean, look at the world over. We've seen, dozens and dozens specifically in the last sort of 7, 8, 9 years, dozens of organizations who've fallen by the wayside, global brands who were, at one time, king of the hill. Look at the Nokias of the world, for example. They were almost the Apple of their day. Late 90s, early 2000s. They were one of the best brands in the world. So how does an organization like that fall, so far and so fast? Well, it fell far and it fell fast because it didn't remain relevant and the world moved on. Now, the challenge is none of us have got a crystal ball. But what we can do is change our approach to strategy. One of the issues with most corporates and most senior leadership teams is because they don't understand how innovation works and all of the ecosystem that you tap into when you really start to embed innovation and the frameworks and the approaches, that approach teaches us to have a completely different view of strategy. The challenge with most senior teams is they're still looking strategically too far out. So by the time that horizon, that time frame emerges, and they're halfway through rolling out a program or a piece of change or a product, the world's moved on, right? We know all the data that we can gather, and not necessarily we, but consultancies all over the world constantly gather data on this. Annual global innovation surveys from many of the big consultancies, we're consistently showing that large corporates are still taking too long to get new products and services to market. And some of that data suggests some products that big corporates are bringing to market have taken 4 to 5 years to bring to market. Well, that was all right 10, 20 years ago, but it's not okay now. So, it's easy to demonstrate the impact of not remaining relevant and not being able to operate at the right pace. And when you can demonstrate that to senior teams, it does, the penny drops with the majority of senior teams.
Okay, great. So let's go into one of these companies that one or more of these companies that you've worked with or you've seen that weren't able to move fast enough. And you were advising them and saying, hey, look, here are things you can do. Here are steps you should take. And what was the ones that didn't work, the ones that really couldn't accept it, what was ultimately the barrier for them? What was holding them back and the challenges that were just too hard for them to overcome?
In every instance, in every single instance, it's senior teams and leadership's ability to recognize that they need to change before starting to change the organization. But in almost every instance, the excuse is the organization is too hard to change. So and that's about that's a lack of empathy. It's a lack of self-awareness, and it's a lack of enough emotional intelligence to understand that I, as an individual leader, and us as a collective leadership team, we're the conductors of the orchestra, and we need to get our stuff together first. We need to understand how to lead for innovation, and we need to recognize that that is demonstrably different than generic good practice management and leadership, which is what we've been taught to do for the past 10, 20, 30 years. And we need to recognize that if we as a senior team don't make this shift, then the organization won't be able to shift either. And in almost every instance, it's been that leadership challenge as the barrier.
That makes complete sense. If you flip that around and you say some of these were actually able to do it, is it just that they were able to either change internally, or were they already in a place where they were willing to change and now they just needed tools? What do you think works on the other side?
It's willingness to change and recognize it. Most of the time when people like me get brought into an organization, it's because the senior team have said, we need to take action. We need to do something about the position we're in. And, to the point you made a while ago, we're actually okay at the moment, but we're clever enough to understand that that is a very fortunate position, and that gives us a period of grace. That the fact that we're all right at the minute gives us some air cover, and it gives us some time to be able to prepare for what's going to come next and what we need to do next. So they capitalize on the privileged position that they're in by not necessarily having a massive burning platform at that moment. The switched on ones that I've worked with capitalize on that and say, let's start to change, because we know that something's coming. We know the world's changing, and we know we need to remain relevant. So let's start working on it now, because it's not 2 workshops and Chris doing a keynote and we're all finished. It's months and months and months and months and months of work. And those are the ones that are successful. But that is a senior team that understands and is willing to put that work in.
Yeah, brilliant. That makes complete sense as well, that you need to address this before it's a crisis.
Look,
you need to get started.
You think how long it takes to build leadership capability in these areas, to change mindset, to change behavior, to start to redesign some of the fabric of an organization culturally, right? It's months and months, if not years, for many organizations. When the problem arises and when it's on the horizon, the time frame is then already too short to make the kind of for an intervention that really needs to happen. The time frame is already too short. The clock's already ticking. So getting ahead of that is really important. And a lot of organizations are, the sun's setting, right? And they're still trying to, they're still trying to do 200 mile an hour, towards the horizon. And for many of them, it's going to be too late.
Okay, so are there specific companies out there, global brands, that you think are doing well at this time in terms of either changing culture or having culture that is open to innovation? These are companies we could aspire to be, or we could admire, or just at least learn, something about.
Yeah, so I'll give you, there's a few, there's a couple of companies that we're working with at the moment that are still on a journey and people might listen to these names and go, well, actually, I know them and I don't think they're massively innovative. Well, the point is, these companies are huge. But what we're seeing from these particular clients is they are putting everything in place and are getting things in place and are making the right preparation for changing the organization in pursuit of all this stuff. One of them is ING, who I mentioned earlier. Another great organization to look at in terms of how mature their approaches to innovation is Telefonica.
Okay, excellent. I've got a kind of a follow-on question that we hadn't talked about before, but I wanted to bring up now, and that is when you look at a list of global brands that that are the brands today, the top 100 brands today or something, and then you go back 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, you don't really see many of the same brands. But then when you do see a brand that's there today that was there 100 years ago or 50 years ago even, that's astonishing, right? And then it makes you want to look at that company and say, well, how did you manage to last this long? Did you just have such a great moat, or were you actually changing along the way? Were you morphing so that you're not the same company, right? It's not the same company that it was 100 years ago. So in those cases, I'm assuming there's an innovation culture, or at least some ability to shift. Is there a way to test that? Is there a way to maybe look? You said you had an innovation maturity.
Yeah, maturity assessment. Yeah,
right. I mean, so
the challenge with that is we would have needed to have assessed them, a decade ago or more to be able to then say, what shifted, what's changed, what's remained, what have you got better at, in what areas have you matured but that's how we assess organizations at the minute.
Right. So if I'm sitting here, let's just talk about our portfolio, right? Mm-hmm. We got our retirement portfolio. Mm. If I'm putting money into a company that I expect to have to be there 10, 15, 20 years, let's look at Dennis, right? He's just getting started. He needs to start investing for his portfolio. So he has a retirement portfolio waiting for him. Mm. When he's looking at these companies, he would be wise to invest in those that are going to be around, and not Absolutely. Only just around, but thriving. Yeah. Are there clues? If we listen to, the quarterly report, and the management comes on and gives a statement and they answer some questions, can we learn from that? Are we learning from keynotes? Are we learning from things that they're writing? What clues do we have?
Yeah, I think, if you look at that sort of stocks and trading analogy, what the guys in that world do is they're constantly seeking out information. They're looking at trends specifically. And if you look at some of those big global brands, and you reverse engineer, why are they still around today? In the face of the Fortune 500, how many of, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but how few of the Fortune 500 still exist today? But the ones that do, why are they still performing well when 475 of their peers have gone, or whatever it is? And if you reverse engineer their lifespan, what have they done, and you have to find out how have they stayed relevant. So if you look at every decade, like what new things did they bring out? What new products did they bring out? Was there a change in CEO? Did they adopt in any decade? Did they adopt a completely new leadership style or cultural style or management style? What were these guys doing? And you can map all that out. If you look at someone like, do you know the brand? I don't know how you pronounce it, but Haier or Haier.
I'm not familiar with them.
They're I think they're Chinese. I read an article the other day. It's something, if everyone Googles it, their CEO has completely transformed the organization. Like, don't quote me on the number, but like 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 times in his tenure. He's been the CEO for decades, but he has consistently and regularly completely transformed the organization, culturally, leadership style, everything. And the best analogy is look at how Madonna has reinvented herself every decade, or maybe even twice a decade in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, right? But she's done that, and she's remained absolutely relevant, and she's made that transition and reinvented herself to stay absolutely relevant with where we are in the world, with the type of music, with the way culture shifted, with the way society has moved and the things it now doesn't value and the new things it does. And she's been probably the most successful artist in the world at reinventing herself and staying relevant. That's what we have to do as organizations, because when the world shifts, when society shifts, when consumer habits and demands and requirements and needs shift, we have to, as organizations, shift at the same pace. We have to take a leaf out of Madonna's book, and we have to reinvent ourselves every time the world makes a change. And those organizations you mentioned have done that in various ways and in their ways to enable them to stay relevant. And the CEO at Hire, however you pronounce it, the guys at like Harvard and all the top business experts in the world, most of their work and the things they write is based on how this guy has transformed the organization and why he's done it at a certain time and what the catalysts were and how he did it. So if the best business minds in the world are looking to people like that to learn about why this guy's done it and how he's done it, then we should be studying organizations like that as well.
That's fair. I'm going to assume also, though, that it's going to be very difficult to get access to the information that is ultimately at work.
The stuff.
The successes. So I've worked in some companies that were extremely innovative, large, made changes, dramatic changes along the way that were successful up to a point where they apparently no longer were able to make those kinds of changes. But when I was there, very successful at just completely blowing everything up and starting over.
Yeah.
And I would say that my experience with that, and I'm going to point to Sun Microsystems in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And that company was growing so fast at the time and was making some pretty dramatic changes while it was competing with Microsoft. And those changes were actually quite successful, and it became a major brand up until a point where it really kind of lost its way. And I'm going to attribute some of that to the original leadership, but I would also argue that it's going to be very difficult for someone to go in and sort out exactly what happened. You'd have to do a lot of interviews and really examine some of the decisions, and not just listen to one or two people, but really listen to a broad spectrum. I've also worked in some really large companies that just didn't seem to have the ability or willingness to make those kinds of changes. And they weren't always large. Sometimes they were small. And I agree with you that it does come down to leadership. Do you have any, well, anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as an example of Sun Microsystems, and trying to compete against Microsoft, look at what Satya Nadella has done at Microsoft over the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, that is, to take an organization like that, that is a behemoth of an organization, right? These are some of the biggest companies in the world, super complex. Look at all the different facets and components of organizations of that size. And yet what he's done there and the success that he's had over the past 4 or 5 years. But and it's not, this story isn't all rosy, and I know people inside Microsoft. So, there's an inside track on some of these things, which means this isn't all a bed of roses, but look at the things he's done around growth mindset, around shifting leadership capability, around innovation, around reframing how senior people look at failure and risk. And we know from leadership teams that looking at failure and risk and getting things wrong and impacting core business, all of those things are in many ways some of the biggest barriers to leaders understanding how to lead for innovation. And what Satya Nadella has done at Microsoft is not said we're going to build a culture of innovation, but he's built a culture of learning through their focus on growth mindset. And the byproduct of that is leaders understanding more and being more comfortable with the behavior that leads to innovation without saying we're going to teach you how to innovate per se. I think it's really, really clever. So there are examples of brilliant pieces of work like that, if you go out and look for them.
Well, excellent. Thank you very, very much, Cris, for everything you've been able to share with us and you've been willing to share with us today. You are, like I said before, a blessing for true innovators out there, and we should all be thankful that you sacrificed your 9 lives,
yes,
so that you could be in position to be out there telling the story now. And I'm looking forward to reading your book and digging into culture. So, Dennis, do we have anything else, or are we going to wrap up?
Well, I'm super happy. I have leaned back in my chair here and have enjoyed the conversation very much. Cris, like Stuart said, thank you so much. You're a blessing to the innovation space here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks to you and to Edison 365 for the Edison guys for inviting me on the program. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Edison 365 podcast. We certainly enjoyed the conversation and hope that you're left with more knowledge of the innovation space. We have more exciting guests coming up, so make sure to like, subscribe,